The island's transformation. The sea as a highway. Hello everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we will embark on a journey through one of the most extraordinary stories in history, the rise and fall of the British Empire. For over 3 centuries, this small island nation ruled nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed almost a third of humanity. It was an empire so vast that the sun never set on its territories, stretching from the frozen shores of Canada to the burning deserts of Australia. But how did a rainy island off the coast of Europe come to dominate the globe? And why did the seemingly invincible empire eventually crumble to dust? Tonight we explore the ambition, the brutality, the genius, and ultimately the arrogance of the greatest empire the world has ever known. So settle in, dim the lights, and let me tell you the story of how Britain conquered the world and why it couldn't hold on to it forever. Every empire begins with a dream, and Britain's dream was born of water. Surrounded by the gray-green seas that both protected and imprisoned it, this small archipelago sat like a fortress off the shores of Europe, close enough to smell the smoke of continental wars, far enough to watch them burn from a safe distance. In the early 1600s, Britain was hardly the master of anything outside its shores. It was a collection of fragmented kingdoms, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, often at war with each other, frequently subject to invasion by foreign armies, economically dependent on selling wool to Dutch merchants. The idea that this rain-soaked, fog-shrouded island would one day rule India, Australia, and half of Africa would have seemed the fantasy of a madman. But the sea that surrounded Britain was not merely a barrier, it was a highway. And the English, perhaps because they had no choice, learned to read that highway better than anyone else in the world. The transformation began with a single moment of defiance. In 1588, when the Spanish Armada, 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, sailed up the English Channel like a floating city of conquest. It seemed unstoppable. Spain was the superpower of the age, master of the Americas, controller of the world's silver mines, the sword of Catholic Europe. But the English had something the Spanish did not expect: desperation coupled with innovation. Their ships were smaller, faster, more maneuverable. Their captains were pirates turned patriots, men like Francis Drake who had learned to fight by stealing Spanish treasure. When the two fleets met in the narrow waters off the English coast, it was not merely a battle between navies. It was a clash of 2 different ways of seeing the world. The Spanish fought like soldiers, seeking to board the enemy ships and engage in hand-to-hand combat. The English fought like merchants, keeping their distance, using their cannons to crush the enemy. It was the difference between medieval chivalry and modern warfare, between honor and efficiency. When the storms came and scattered the Spanish fleet, the English claimed it was divine intervention. Perhaps so. Or perhaps it was simply the first sign that the future belonged not to the largest armies, but to the most adaptive minds. The defeat of the Armada was more than a military victory. It was a psychological transformation. For the first time, the English began to see themselves not as a peripheral European kingdom, but as a potential maritime power. The sea, which had once been their prison, became their path to the world. Capitalism with cannons, companies, and colonies. Queen Elizabeth I instinctively understood this transformation. She began to encourage English privateers, essentially legalized pirates, to raid Spanish treasure galleons returning from the Americas. Men like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh became national heroes, bringing home Spanish gold and tales of distant lands ripe for conquest. But it was the creation of joint stock companies that truly launched the British Empire. This was something new in the world. Private corporations with the right to wage war, sign treaties, and administer territory. It was capitalism armed with cannons, commerce backed by conquest. The Muscovy Company, founded in 1555, opened trade with Russia across the frozen Arctic seas. The Levant Company, 1592, traded with the Ottoman Empire, bringing silk and spices from the mysterious East. And in 1600, the most important of all was chartered, the East India Company, EIC. The EIC's motto was simple: trade follows the flag, but in practice it was often the reverse. The flag followed the trade. The company's first voyage to India in 1601 was a modest affair. 4 ships carried English wool and hoped to return with Indian spices, but it marked the beginning of a relationship that would transform both Britain and India, making one the mistress of the world and reducing the other to colonial subservience. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, English colonists were gaining a foothold in the New World. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was a disaster. Most of the colonists died of disease and starvation. The settlement survived on the thinnest of margins, sustained by the cultivation of tobacco and the brutal exploitation of enslaved Africans. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620 were fleeing religious persecution, not seeking an empire. But they carried with them something more powerful than armies: the English language, English law, and English ideas about property, government, and individual rights. These ideas spread across the continent like seeds on the wind, taking root in soil that had never known European civilization. By 1650, England had established colonies in Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, and on the Caribbean islands of Barbados and Jamaica. These were not yet the jewels of a global empire. They were struggling settlements on the edge of the known world, constantly under threat of disease, starvation, and hostile neighbors. But they represented something unprecedented: the systematic colonization of distant lands by a European power. The Spanish had conquered vast territories in the Americas, but they did so primarily to extract gold and silver. The English were different. They came to stay, to build new societies, to recreate England in foreign lands. This difference would prove crucial to the ultimate success of the empire. Spanish colonies remained dependent on the mother country, existing primarily to enrich Spain. English colonies, by contrast, developed their own economies, their own institutions, their own identity. They became an extension of England, not merely its possessions. The English also proved more adaptive than their rivals. Where the Spanish imposed their culture and religion on conquered peoples, the English were more pragmatic. They were willing to work with local rulers, adopt local customs when it suited them, govern indirectly through existing power structures. This pragmatism was born of necessity. England simply lacked the resources to impose direct rule over vast territories, but it became a source of strength, allowing the English to control far larger areas with far fewer soldiers than their competitors. By the end of the 17th century, the foundations of the British Empire were laid. The Royal Navy was becoming the most powerful fleet in the world. English merchants traded in every ocean. English colonists were spreading across North America and the Caribbean, and the East India Company was beginning its conquest of India. The stage was set for the greatest expansion in human history, but first, Britain had to become Britain. The birth of Great Britain. The Act of Union, 1707. In 1707, something remarkable occurred in the corridors of power in London and Edinburgh. 2 ancient enemies, England and Scotland, decided to become a single nation. The Act of Union created Great Britain, and with it, the political foundation for the greatest empire the world would ever see. But this union was not born of love or shared identity. It was born of calculation, desperation, and mutual need. Scotland, bankrupted by a disastrous attempt to create its own colony in Panama, the Darien scheme, needed English money. England, faced with the prospect of a hostile Scotland allied with France, needed Scottish loyalty. The marriage was arranged like a business deal, hammered out in smoke-filled rooms by men who understood that sentimentality was a luxury they could not afford. Scottish nobles were bought off with English gold. English politicians were promised Scottish support, and the common people of both nations were largely ignored. Yet from this cynical beginning, something extraordinary emerged. The union of England and Scotland created a new type of nation that was both ancient and modern, traditional and innovative, conservative and revolutionary. It was a nation that could draw on the commercial genius of England and the intellectual brilliance of Scotland, the naval tradition of the South and the military prowess of the North. The Scots, who had been the enemies of England for centuries, became the most fiercely loyal builders of the empire. Scottish engineers built the roads and bridges that connected the empire. Scottish doctors and teachers spread across the colonies, carrying education and medicine to the farthest corners of the world. Scottish soldiers fought in every imperial war, their kilts and bagpipes becoming symbols of British power from the Highlands to the Himalayas. But the Union also created something darker, a sense of racial and cultural superiority that would justify centuries of exploitation and oppression. The British began to see themselves not just as successful, but as inherently superior to other peoples. They were Protestants in a Catholic world, civilized among barbarians, free among slaves. This sense of superiority was reinforced by the Enlightenment, the great intellectual movement that swept through 18th century Britain. Thinkers like Adam Smith, David Hume, and Edmund Burke developed theories about economics, politics, and society that seemed to explain British success and justify British expansion. The engine of expansion, the 7 Years' War. But the true engine of British expansion was not philosophy, it was war. The 18th century was an age of near-constant conflict as European powers fought for dominance in Europe, the Americas, and Asia. And in these wars, Britain discovered its greatest advantage, the ability to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously while its enemies were locked down on land. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, was the first truly global conflict in human history. It was fought across 3 continents on all oceans, from the forests of North America to the plains of India, from the Caribbean islands to the coast of Africa. In North America, British and colonial forces captured Quebec and Montreal, ending French rule in Canada. The death of General James Wolfe on the Plains of Abraham became a legend. In India, Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 gave the East India Company control over Bengal, the richest province of the subcontinent. It was a battle won not by superior tactics, but by superior corruption. Clive bribed the enemy's generals to switch sides at the crucial moment. In the Caribbean, British forces seized the French sugar islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, adding their wealth to the growing imperial treasury. In Africa, British traders established new posts along the coast, feeding the growing demand for enslaved labor in the American colonies. The Treaty of Paris 1763 marked the emergence of Britain as the dominant world power. France ceded Canada and all its North American territories east of the Mississippi. Spain, allied with France, gave up Florida. Britain now controlled the eastern half of North America and was the undisputed master of India. But the victory came with a price that would ultimately prove fatal to the unity of the empire. The war cost Britain £140 million, exceeding the government's entire annual revenue. The national debt doubled, and Parliament was desperately seeking new sources of income. The obvious solution was to tax the American colonies, which had benefited from British protection during the war. The Stamp Act of 1765 required the colonists to pay a tax on all printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, even dice. To British politicians, this seemed reasonable. The colonists should pay for their own defense. But the colonists saw it differently. They had no representation in Parliament. How then could Parliament tax them? No taxation without representation became the slogan of American resistance. What began as a dispute over taxes escalated into a constitutional crisis, then an armed rebellion, and finally a war of independence that tore the empire apart. The American Revolution was Britain's first great imperial catastrophe, but it was also a lesson. The loss of the 13 colonies was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological shock that forced Britain to rethink their entire approach to empire. The old system of governing colonies through local assemblies and traditional elites had failed. The new system would be based on direct rule, professional administration, and overwhelming military force. The empire that emerged from the ashes of the American Revolution would be more centralized, more efficient, and more ruthless than anything before. But it would also be more fragile, because it would be held together not by shared identity and common interests, but by fear and force. The East India Company. Trade as empire. After the American Revolution, Britain faced a choice that would define the next century of human history. It could retreat from empire, accepting the loss of America as proof that distant territories were too expensive and dangerous to hold. Or it could double down, using the lessons learned from defeat to build an even greater empire. Britain chose empire. But this new empire would be different from what had come before. It would be built not by settlers seeking a new home, but by merchants seeking new markets, not by soldiers conquering territory, but by administrators managing populations, not only by the sword, but by the ledger book and the steam engine. The East India Company, EIC, became the laboratory for this new kind of imperialism. What began as a trading venture grew into something unprecedented in human history, a private corporation that governed more people than lived in all of Europe. The company's employees were not just merchants. They were soldier administrators, men who fought battles in the morning and balanced ledgers after lunch. In India, the company found a subcontinent in chaos. The Mughal Empire, which had once ruled most of India with magnificent splendor, was collapsing like a house built on sand. Local rulers fought each other for territory and influence, while French and English traders competed for commercial advantage. This was the perfect opportunity for ambitious men with flexible morals and superior firepower. Robert Clive embodied this new breed of imperial entrepreneur. A clerk turned soldier, he understood that in the modern world, commerce and conquest were inseparable. At the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Clive's small army of 3,000 men defeated the Nawab of Bengal's force of 50,000. It was not superior tactics that won. It was superior corruption. Clive bribed the Nawab's generals to switch sides at the crucial moment. The victory at Plassey gave the EIC control over Bengal, the richest province of India. Suddenly, a trading company found itself governing 20 million people and collecting taxes from a territory larger than Britain itself. The wealth that flowed from Bengal financed Britain's wars against Napoleon and fueled the Industrial Revolution that was transforming the British Isles. But the company's success came at a terrible price for India. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed 10 million people, a third of the province's population. Company officials, focused on extracting maximum profit for shareholders in London, ignored the warning signs of crop failure and continued to demand taxes even as people starved in the streets. This was the dark heart of the new imperialism. The reduction of human beings to economic units, the treatment of entire civilizations as sources of profit. The company's administrators did not see themselves as tyrants. They saw themselves as rational managers, applying scientific principles to the business of governance. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of India, tried to reform the company's administration and reduce the worst abuses. But he was fighting a system designed for exploitation, not administration. Company employees received minimal salaries, but were expected to make their fortunes through private trade and corruption. The result was systematic plunder on a scale that surpassed imagination. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was transforming Britain into something the world had never seen, into a nation that could produce goods faster and cheaper than any competitor, and then use its naval supremacy to force open markets across the globe. It was capitalism armed with gunboats, free trade enforced at the point of a bayonet. Steam engines pumped water out of coal mines, allowing deeper extraction and greater coal production. Steam-powered textile factories produced cloth faster than armies of handloom weavers. Locomotives transported goods across the country with unprecedented speed. And steam-powered ships freed Britain from dependence on wind and weather, allowing year-round navigation to every corner of the globe. The transformation was visible everywhere. Manchester, once a sleepy market town, became a roaring industrial city of cotton mills and smoking chimneys. The air was thick with soot, rivers ran black with industrial waste, and workers lived in slums that shocked even hardened observers. But the factories ran day and night, producing cloth that sold cheaper than traditional artisans everywhere. Free trade and the Opium Wars. British factories could produce goods so cheaply that they destroyed local industries across the world. Indian weavers, who once supplied the world's fine cotton cloth, found themselves unable to compete with machine-made textiles from Manchester. The irony was bitter. Indian cotton was shipped to Britain, manufactured into cloth, and then sold back into India at prices that annihilated the local textile industry. This process, extracting raw materials from the colonies and selling them back as finished goods, became the foundation of the imperial economy. Australia supplied wool, Canada, timber, the Caribbean, sugar, and India, cotton and indigo. All these materials were processed in British factories and sold globally at immense profit. The Royal Navy enforced this system with relentless efficiency. British warships patrolled every ocean, protecting British merchants and intimidating potential competitors. The Navy's mission was simple: keep the sea lanes open for British trade and, when necessary, closed to everyone else. The Opium Wars with China perfectly illustrate this system in action. The Chinese Empire, proud and self-sufficient, had little interest in British industrial goods. The Chinese had silk, tea, and porcelain, which Europeans craved, but they saw no need for European products in return. This created a trade imbalance that was draining British silver reserves. But British merchants found one product that Chinese consumers craved: opium, grown in British-controlled India. The drug trade was incredibly profitable. Opium cost next to nothing to produce, but it sold for vast sums in the Chinese markets. Soon millions of Chinese became addicted, and silver flowed out of China to pay for their habit. When the Chinese government tried to ban opium imports to protect its people from addiction, Britain launched a war to protect the drug trade. The First Opium War, 1839-42, ended with China forced to cede Hong Kong to Britain and open 5 ports to British trade. The Second Opium War, 1856-60, forced China to legalize the import of opium and open even more ports. This was imperialism in its most cynical form, using military force to compel a sovereign nation to accept a trade that was destroying its people. But from the British perspective, it was just business. Free trade was a moral good, and anyone who opposed it stood in the way of progress and civilization. The same logic applied wherever the British flag was raised. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples were driven off their lands to make room for sheep farms. In Canada, Native American tribes were relocated to reservations to clear the way for railways and settlements. In Africa, traditional societies were dismantled to create new markets for British goods and new sources of raw materials. But the British did not see themselves as conquerors or exploiters. They saw themselves as civilizers, bringing progress and enlightenment to backward peoples. They built railroads and telegraphs, opened schools and hospitals, imposed law and order in chaotic societies. The fact that these improvements primarily served British interests was, in their view, irrelevant. In this lay the genius and the tragedy of the British Empire. It was both destructive and creative, oppressive and modernizing. The same system that impoverished millions also linked them to the global economy. The same administrators who extracted wealth also built infrastructure. The same soldiers who conquered territory also imposed peace between warring communities. By the mid-19th century, Britain achieved something unprecedented in human history: global dominance based not only on military conquest, but on economic and technological supremacy. The empire was becoming self-sustaining, generating the wealth needed to maintain the armies and navies that protected it. But this dominance was built on a foundation of contradictions that would eventually tear it apart. The more successful the empire became, the more it created the conditions for its own destruction. The education systems it created produced colonial elites who understood both Western ideas and local grievances. The economic development it promoted created new classes of people with the resources to organize resistance. The communication networks it built allowed anti-imperial ideas to spread faster than ever before. The empire was at its zenith, but the forces that would eventually destroy it were already stirring in the shadows. The jewel in the crown, India. Of all the territories over which the Union Jack flew, none was more important to the British imagination than India. It was the jewel in the crown, the source of Britain's wealth and power, the proof of its civilizing mission. But India was also the empire's greatest contradiction, a land of ancient wisdom ruled by foreign merchants, a civilization older than Britain itself, reduced to colonial subservience. The transformation of India from a trading partner to an imperial possession was gradual, almost accidental. The East India Company, or EIC, came to trade, not to conquer. But in a land where political power was fragmented, where local rulers waged endless wars for territory and influence, the company found that military force was necessary to protect commercial interests. Every victory led to new responsibilities, new territories to administer, new peoples to control. The company's private army grew from a few hundred European soldiers and Indian sepoys to over 200,000 men. Its territories expanded from a few coastal trading posts to vast provinces containing millions of subjects. By 1850, the company controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, either directly or through puppet princes. It was a government masquerading as a business, an empire disguised as a corporation. The company's shareholders in London received dividends from taxes paid by Indian peasants, while company officials in India made their fortunes from corruption and private trade. But this system contained the seeds of its own destruction. Company rule was extractive and exploitative, designed to maximize profit for shareholders, not to promote the welfare of Indian subjects. Taxes were set at crushing levels, forcing peasants to grow cash crops for export rather than food for local consumption. Traditional industries were destroyed by competition from British industrial goods. Famines became more frequent and more deadly as old systems of grain storage and distribution were dismantled. The company also interfered with Indian religious and social customs in ways that caused deep resentment. British officials, convinced of their own moral superiority, tried to reform what they saw as barbaric customs. They banned sati, the practice of widow self-immolation. They introduced English education that disturbed traditional modes of learning. They alienated Indian rulers and aristocrats by increasingly interfering in their internal affairs. The empire was inviting rebellion. It was not to be long coming. The spark of resentment, the 1857 rebellion. They suppressed thuggee, ritualistic murder practiced by certain criminal gangs. They built roads and railways that cut across sacred sites and disturbed traditional pilgrimage routes. These reforms were often genuinely humane, but they were imposed without consultation or consent. To many Indians, they felt like a tax on their religion and culture, proof that the British were intent on converting them all to Christianity and destroying their ancient way of life. The introduction of the Enfield rifle in 1857 served as the spark that ignited this accumulated resentment. Rumors circulated that the new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, which was offensive to the religious beliefs of both Hindus and Muslims. When Indian soldiers were ordered to bite the cartridges to load the rifles, many refused. What began as a military mutiny quickly spread to become a full-scale rebellion against British rule. Rebels proclaimed the restoration of the Mughal Empire and called for the expulsion of all foreigners. For over a year, a large part of northern India was in a state of revolt. British women and children were killed at Kanpur. The siege of Delhi lasted for months. The defense of Lucknow became an epic of imperial heroism and terror. The British response was savage, beyond comprehension. Entire villages suspected of supporting the rebellion were burned to the ground. Rebels were blown apart by cannons or hanged from trees. The retribution was so brutal that it shocked even some British observers. General Neil's proclamation was typical. "The punishment I inflict is death, and I spare no one." However, the rebellion also revealed the strength of British rule. The majority of Indian soldiers remained loyal to the company. The princely states that had treaties with Britain mostly maintained neutrality or actively supported the British. The rebellion was confined to northern India. The south and west remained quiet. When the rebellion was finally suppressed, the British government determined that the East India Company could no longer be trusted to govern India. The Indian Government Act of 1858 transferred control of India from the company to the Crown. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, and the subcontinent became the jewel in the imperial crown. The new system of governance was more centralized and more efficient than company rule, but it was also more distant and more authoritarian. The Indian Civil Service, ICS, recruited through competitive examinations, provided a professional administration. The Indian Army, reorganized with more British officers and fewer Indian soldiers, provided security. A railway system, rapidly expanded after the rebellion, provided both economic development and military control. But the new Raj, rule, also created new problems. The civil service, though professional, was almost entirely British. Indians were excluded from the highest positions in their own government. The army, though efficient, was an army of occupation, designed to prevent rebellion rather than defend against foreign invasion. The railways, though economically beneficial, were built primarily to serve British strategic and commercial interests. Radicalization and the First World War. The partition of Bengal in 1905 became a turning point. Curzon divided the province for administrative reasons, but Indians saw it as a deliberate attempt to weaken Bengali nationalism by dividing Hindus and Muslims. The response was unprecedented. A boycott of British goods, which spread across India, was accompanied by the first serious terrorist campaign against British rule. The Swadeshi movement, which promoted Indian-made goods over British imports, showed that Indians could organize effective economic resistance. The terrorist attacks, though limited in scale, demonstrated that some Indians were willing to use violence against British rule. The British were forced to revoke the partition in 1911, but the damage was done. Indian nationalism had been radicalized. The First World War would complete this transformation. India contributed massively to the British war effort. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served overseas, and the Indian government provided hundreds of millions of pounds in loans and supplies. Indians were told they were fighting for freedom and democracy, that their loyalty would be rewarded with self-government. But when the war ended, the promised reforms were minimal. The Government of India Act of 1919 gave Indians a limited role in provincial government, but left real power in British hands. Worse, the Rowlatt Acts of 1919 gave the government emergency powers to arrest and detain Indians without trial. The response was the emergence of Mahatma Gandhi as the leader of Indian nationalism. Gandhi's genius lay in combining Western ideas of civil disobedience with Indian traditions of nonviolence and self-sacrifice. His methods were revolutionary, but his goals were conservative. He sought to purify Indian society as much as he sought to expel British rule. The non-cooperation movement of 1920 to 1922 saw millions of Indians withdraw from British institutions. Students left government schools, lawyers boycotted British courts, voters refused to participate in elections. This was the first mass movement in Indian history, and it showed that British rule ultimately depended on Indian cooperation. The British response was vague and contradictory. They alternated between repression and concession, between treating Gandhi as a dangerous revolutionary and as a saint with whom one could negotiate. They never understood that Gandhi's power came not from his personal charisma, but from his ability to articulate the aspirations of millions of Indians who had lost faith in British rule. By the 1920s, it was clear that the Raj was living on borrowed time. The question was not whether India would become independent, but when and how. The British could delay the inevitable with force and cunning, but they could not prevent it. The jewel in the crown was slipping from their grasp, and with it, the foundation of their global empire. The scramble for Africa, new competition. By the 1870s, Britain faced a new and terrifying reality: competition. For most of the 19th century, Britain had enjoyed what historians call free trade imperialism, the ability to dominate world markets through superior industrial capacity and naval power without the costs of formal colonization. But now, other European powers were catching up, and the comfortable world of British supremacy was collapsing. Germany, united under Prussian leadership in 1871, was rapidly industrializing and building a powerful navy. France, recovering from its humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, sought to restore its prestige through colonial expansion. Russia pushed south toward India and east toward the Pacific. Even small countries like Belgium carved out colonial empires in Africa. The result was the so-called scramble for Africa, the fastest and most complete colonization of a continent in human history. In 1870, Europeans controlled only 10% of Africa. By 1900, they controlled 90%. It was a feeding frenzy of imperial ambition as European powers seized territory as quickly as they could survey it. Britain's strategy was to secure the most valuable territories before their competitors could claim them. The Cape Colony in South Africa controlled the sea route to India. Egypt controlled the Suez Canal, the shortest route to the east. Nigeria controlled the palm oil trade. Kenya controlled the headwaters of the Nile. Each territory was part of a global puzzle, valuable not only for its resources, but for its strategic position in the imperial system. Cecil Rhodes, the diamond magnate who dreamed of building a railway from Cape Town to Cairo, embodied this new aggressive imperialism. Rhodes believed that British expansion was not merely profitable, but morally necessary, that the Anglo-Saxon race had a duty to civilize the world, and that more territory under British rule meant more happiness for humanity. The British South Africa Company, chartered in 1889, was the instrument of Rhodes's expansion. Like the old East India Company, it was a private corporation with governmental powers, the right to sign treaties, maintain armies, and administer territories. The company conquered what would later become Rhodesia, adding 500,000 square miles to the empire. The scramble for Africa led Britain into conflict with both European powers and the African peoples who would not be colonized. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 attempted to regulate the partition of Africa, but in reality, it was simply a way for European powers to divide the continent without fighting each other. The conference established the principle of effective occupation. European claims to African territory had to be backed by actual administration and control. This led to a race to establish trading posts, sign treaties with local chiefs, and plant flags in remote corners of the continent. The Africans themselves were not consulted. They were simply obstacles to be overcome or allies to be bought. The human cost of this scramble for Africa was enormous. The Congo Free State, established by King Leopold of Belgium, became synonymous with colonial brutality. The Belgian administration used forced labor to extract rubber and ivory, killing millions of Congolese in the process. The German suppression of the Herero and Nama people in southwest Africa was genocide by any definition, wiping out entire ethnic groups. Britain's record was little better. The conquest of Sudan involved the systematic destruction of the modest state and the massacre of its defenders at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. Winston Churchill, who participated in the battle as a young cavalry officer, described it as the most signal triumph ever gained by the arms of science over barbarians. The Zulu War of 1879 led to a crushing defeat for British forces at Isandlwana before they finally crushed Zulu resistance at Ulundi. The war was fought ostensibly to protect British settlers, but its true goal was the destruction of the last independent African kingdom in South Africa. The most difficult of all were the Anglo-Boer Wars in South Africa. The Boers, Dutch-speaking farmers who had lived in South Africa for 2 centuries, had established independent republics in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. When gold was discovered in the Transvaal in 1886, British interest in the region soared. The Second Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, was Britain's toughest colonial conflict. The Boers, fighting on their home ground with superior knowledge of the terrain, proved to be formidable opponents. They used guerrilla tactics that frustrated British attempts to wage conventional war. The British response was to implement a scorched earth policy, burning Boer farms and rounding up the civilian population into concentration camps. Over 26,000 Boer women and children died in these camps, mostly from disease and malnutrition. This was a preview of the total warfare that would characterize the 20th century. The war cost Britain $200 million and required 450,000 troops to defeat 60,000 Boer fighters. It was a Pyrrhic victory that damaged Britain's international reputation and exposed the limits of imperial power. The empire could still win wars, only at the cost of immense expense and by methods that shocked the civilized world. Meanwhile, in Asia, Britain faced new challenges to its dominance. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 shortened the route to India, but also made the empire more vulnerable to disruption. The canal was controlled by a French company, and France remained Britain's greatest rival in the region. The Egyptian crisis and the seizure of the Suez Canal. The British response was to buy a controlling stake in the company that owned the canal in 1875, using money borrowed from the Rothschild banking house. This was a brilliant coup that gave Britain control over the most important waterway in the world, but it also obligated Britain to defend Egypt, which controlled the southern end of the canal. The Egyptian crisis of 1882 forced Britain to choose between its economic interests and its liberal principles. A nationalist revolt led by Colonel Ahmed Urabi threatened to overthrow the pro-British government and nationalize the canal. Britain could have accepted Egyptian independence, but that would have meant losing control of the route to India. Instead, Britain invaded Egypt and established a veiled protectorate that would last until 1956. The occupation was supposed to be temporary, but temporary occupations have a way of becoming permanent. Egypt became another fragment of the imperial puzzle, valuable not in itself, but for its strategic position. The same pattern was repeated throughout the world. Britain acquired territories not because it wanted them, but because it could not afford to let other powers have them. The empire was becoming a victim of its own success, forced to expand to protect what it already possessed. By 1900, the British Empire covered 11 million square miles and ruled 400 million people. It was the largest empire in human history, but it was also becoming increasingly cumbersome and costly to maintain. The expense of defending so many territories placed a heavy burden on the British economy, while the complexity of administering so many different peoples overwhelmed the imperial administration. More ominously, the empire was creating its own enemies. Every act of expansion bred resistance. Every new territory brought new obligations. Every success created new vulnerabilities. The empire, built through opportunism and pragmatism, was becoming a rigid system that could not adapt to changing circumstances. The scramble for everything gave Britain the world, but it also gave the world reasons to hate Britain. The empire was approaching its zenith, but the forces destined to destroy it were already gaining strength. Game of Thrones in Central Asia, the Great Game. In the mountains and deserts between the Russian and British empires, another war was being fought. A war of spies and diplomats, of exploration and intrigue. A game of chess played out over thousands of miles of the most rugged terrain on Earth. This was the Great Game, a century-long struggle between Britain and Russia for control of Central Asia and influence over the approaches to India. The game began with fear. British officials in India, looking north to the high peaks of the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas, saw not natural barriers, but a highway for invasion. Beyond those mountains lay the vast Russian Empire, expanding southward with a seemingly inexorable speed. Every Russian advance into the Caucasus, into Central Asia, toward the borders of Afghanistan, was viewed as a step toward the ultimate goal, India, the jewel in the British crown. Russian officials, looking south from their new conquests in Central Asia, saw British influence spreading north from India like a slow poison. British agents were operating in Afghanistan, Persia, and Tibet. British gold financed local rulers who might otherwise have been Russian allies. British maps were charting territories that Russia considered its sphere of influence. Both empires were driven by the same logic. In a world where great powers struggled for global dominance, neutrality was impossible. Every territory not under your control was potentially under your enemy's control. Every local ruler who was not your ally was potentially your enemy's ally. The Great Game was not only about territory, it was about the balance of power in Asia and, ultimately, in the world. The players in this game were extraordinary men, soldiers, diplomats, explorers, and spies who operated in some of the most dangerous and remote regions on Earth. On the British side were men like Alexander Burnes, who traveled disguised as a merchant through Afghanistan and Central Asia, mapping territories and assessing the loyalty of local rulers. There was Arthur Connolly, who coined the term the Great Game and died horribly in a prison in Bukhara. There was Francis Younghusband, who led a military expedition into Tibet and forced the Dalai Lama to sign a treaty. On the Russian side were men like Nikolai Przhevalsky, the explorer who mapped vast areas of Central Asia and Tibet, gathering intelligence for the Russian government. There was Mikhail Skobelev, the general who conquered the Central Asian Khanates with a combination of military genius and ruthless brutality. There was Count Nikolai Ignatiev, the diplomat who negotiated treaties that spread Russian influence deep into Asia. These men played for the highest stakes imaginable. If Russia could establish a reliable route to the Indian Ocean, it would break Britain's naval supremacy and threaten the foundation of the British Empire. If Britain could create a buffer zone of friendly states between Russia and India, it could protect its most valuable possession and maintain its global dominance. Afghanistan and the conclusion of the game. Afghanistan became the central battleground of the Great Game. This mountainous tribal country controlled the passes between Central Asia and India. Whoever controlled Afghanistan could threaten the other's empire. But Afghanistan was also one of the hardest countries in the world to conquer and hold. A graveyard of empires where foreign armies came to die. The First Anglo-Afghan War, 1839 to 1842, was a disaster for Britain. A British army of 16,000 was virtually annihilated during the retreat from Kabul. Only one European survivor reached the safety of the British lines. The massacre shocked the British public and demonstrated the limits of imperial power. But the British learned from their mistakes. The Second Anglo-Afghan War, 1878 to 1880, was more successful. British forces occupied Kabul and forced the Afghan ruler to accept a British resident and British control over Afghanistan's foreign policy. Afghanistan became a buffer state, nominally independent but effectively under British control. The Great Game was not fought only in Afghanistan. In Persia, British and Russian agents struggled for influence over the Shah and his ministers. The country was divided into spheres of influence, with Russian dominance in the north and British dominance in the south. The Persian government, trapped between two great powers, played them against each other, gradually losing control over its own territory. In Tibet, the British were concerned about Russian influence over the Dalai Lama. The Younghusband expedition of 1903 to 1904 forced its way into Lhasa and compelled the Tibetan government to sign a treaty excluding foreign influence and opening the country to British trade. It was a brutal campaign, fought at altitudes where men could barely breathe, but it secured Tibet as a British sphere of influence. The Great Game was also fought through proxies and allies. The British supported the Emir of Afghanistan with money and arms, while the Russians supported various Central Asian rulers who opposed British expansion. Both empires used local conflicts to advance their own interests, turning regional disputes into episodes of their global rivalry. But the Great Game was ultimately unwinnable. Neither empire could achieve a decisive victory without risking a general war that could destroy both. The distances were too great, the terrain too difficult, the local populations too hostile to foreign rule. Both empires were overstretched, spending vast sums to maintain positions that were strategically vital but economically worthless. The game began to wind down in the early 20th century as both empires faced new challenges. Russia was weakened by defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 to 1905 and the Revolution of 1905. Britain was increasingly concerned about the growing power of Germany and the need to concentrate its forces closer to home. The Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 formally ended the Great Game, dividing Persia into spheres of influence and recognizing British paramountcy in Afghanistan. Both empires agreed to respect the independence of Tibet, though this was largely meaningless, as neither had the power to effectively control it. The Great Game lasted nearly a century and cost both empires vast sums of money and thousands of lives. It brought civilization to some of the most remote regions on Earth, but it also brought war, exploitation, and cultural destruction. It demonstrated the global reach of European imperialism, but it also exposed its limits. Most importantly, the Great Game showed that the era of easy imperial expansion was ending. The world was filling up with competing empires, and future conflicts would be more dangerous and more destructive than anything that came before. The British Empire won the Great Game, but it also learned that victory in one theater could mean defeat in another. The empire was approaching its moment of maximum size and maximum vulnerability. The Great Game was over, but the bigger game, the struggle for global dominance in the 20th century, was just beginning. The industrial engine and the price of power. By the mid-19th century, Britain had become something unprecedented in human history, a nation that could produce goods faster and cheaper than any competitor, and then use its naval supremacy to forcibly open markets around the globe. The smoking chimneys of Manchester and Birmingham became the engines of empire, generating the wealth that paid for the armies and fleets that conquered the globe. The transformation was visible everywhere. The green fields of England were being covered by brick factories. Clean streams ran black with industrial waste. The ancient rhythms of rural life were being replaced by the mechanical precision of the factory system. Britain was becoming the workshop of the world, and the world was becoming Britain's market. Steam was the driving force behind this transformation. Steam engines pumped water out of coal mines, allowing deeper excavation and greater production of coal. Steam-powered textile mills produced cloth faster than armies of hand-loom weavers. Steam locomotives transported goods across the country with unprecedented speed. Steam ships freed Britain from dependence on wind and weather, allowing year-round navigation to every corner of the globe. The statistics were staggering. By 1850, Britain produced half the world's iron and two-thirds of its coal. British factories churned out more cotton cloth than all the rest of the world combined. British shipyards built more vessels than all other nations combined. British merchants traded in every port from Liverpool to Hong Kong. But this industrial supremacy came with a human price that was almost impossible to calculate. The new factory towns were hell on earth, breeding grounds for pollution, overcrowding, and disease. Workers labored 14 hours a day in conditions that would have shocked medieval serfs. Children as young as 6 worked in textile mills, their small fingers ideally suited for tying broken threads. Women worked in match factories, their faces glowing from phosphorus poisoning that would eventually kill them. Friedrich Engels described the working quarters of Manchester as a hell upon earth. The air was thick with smoke and chemical fumes. The streets were open sewers. Entire families lived in a single room with no windows or ventilation. Life expectancy in the industrial cities was half that of the countryside. And yet, this system of exploitation was also a system of liberation. Factory workers, however miserable their conditions, were free in ways peasants never were. They could leave their work, move to other cities, organize unions, demand better wages. The industrial system created not only wealth, but a working class that would eventually challenge the entire structure of capitalist society. The wealth generated by British industry flowed outward through the empire like blood through arteries. Raw materials came from the colonies, cotton from India and America, wool from Australia, timber from Canada, sugar from the Caribbean. The burden of empire, morality, and expense. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire achieved something unprecedented in human history. It governed nearly 400 million people across 11 million square miles, controlling territories on every continent and in every ocean. The sun never set on the Union Jack, and British power seemed as permanent as the tides. But this vast empire was also becoming a burden that was slowly crushing the nation that created it. The cost of defending so many territories placed a heavy burden on the British economy. The complexity of governing so many diverse peoples overwhelmed the imperial administration, and the very success of the empire created the conditions for its own destruction. The problem was not just size, though size was certainly part of it. How do you govern an empire that stretches from the Arctic tundra of Canada to the tropical jungles of Burma, from the sheep farms of Australia to the diamond mines of South Africa? How do you create a common policy for peoples as diverse as Scottish Highlanders and Indian peasants, Canadian lumberjacks and Egyptian fellaheen? The British solution was to govern through a complex hierarchy of different systems. Some territories, such as Canada and Australia, were self-governing dominions with their own parliaments and prime ministers. Others, like India, were governed directly by British administrators. Still others, like the princely states of India or the protectorates of Africa, were governed indirectly through local rulers who accepted British oversight. This system worked, but it was incredibly expensive and increasingly difficult to maintain. The Indian civil service required thousands of British administrators who had to be recruited, trained, transported, and paid. The Indian Army required hundreds of thousands of soldiers, both British and Indian, to maintain order and defend the frontiers. The Royal Navy required hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors to patrol the sea lanes and protect British trade. The financial burden was enormous. By 1900, Britain spent over 40% of its government budget on defense, much of which was for imperial purposes. The cost of the Second Anglo-Boer War alone, £200 million, was more than the entire annual budget of the British government just 50 years earlier. But the real burden of empire was not just financial, it was moral and psychological. The British convinced themselves that their empire was different from all previous ones, that it was a force for good in the world, a civilizing mission that brought progress and enlightenment to backward peoples. This belief was essential to their self-image as a nation and their justification for ruling over so many others. Yet the reality of imperial rule was often brutal and exploitative. The suppression of the Indian Rebellion in 1857 involved mass killings and atrocities that shocked even hardened soldiers. The conquest of Sudan culminated in the massacre of thousands of modest warriors at Omdurman. The concentration camps of the Anglo-Boer War killed tens of thousands of women and children. These contradictions created a kind of cognitive dissonance in the British mind. They sincerely believed they were bringing civilization to the world, yet they were constantly forced to use uncivilized methods to maintain their rule. They proclaimed the benefits of free trade while using military force to open markets. They spoke of the rule of law while governing through emergency powers and martial law. The burden of justifying these contradictions rested heavily on the shoulders of the imperial administrators, soldiers, and settlers who had to live with the daily reality of colonial rule. Many of them developed what Rudyard Kipling termed the white man's burden, a sense of duty and self-sacrifice that helped them rationalize their role in the imperial system. Kipling's poem, published in 1899, perfectly captured this mentality. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. This was not cynical propaganda, it was a genuine belief. Many British officials sincerely saw themselves as servants of humanity, sacrificing their own comfort and safety to bring order and progress to chaotic and backward societies. They built railroads and hospitals, established schools and courts, imposed peace between warring tribes and communities. But this paternalistic attitude was also deeply racist and condescending. It assumed that non-European peoples were incapable of governing themselves, that they needed British guidance to achieve civilization, that their own cultures and traditions were obstacles to progress rather than a valuable heritage to be preserved. This attitude was reinforced by the pseudo-scientific racism that was popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. Social Darwinism suggested that the British had evolved to a higher level of civilization than other races, that their dominance was natural and inevitable. Anthropology and ethnology provided a seemingly scientific justification for treating different peoples as fundamentally different and unequal.
Seeds of destruction, the end of control. The result was a system of racial hierarchy that permeated every aspect of imperial life. In India, British officials lived in segregated cantonments, frequented segregated clubs, and socialized only with other Europeans. In Africa, white settlers received the best land, while Africans were restricted to reservations. In Australia, indigenous peoples were viewed as a dying race, whose disappearance was both inevitable and desirable. This racial hierarchy was not merely a matter of social custom, it was enforced by law. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, known as the White Australia Policy, excluded non-European immigrants from Australia. Similar laws in South Africa restricted the movement and rights of the African majority. Even in Britain itself, there were informal but powerful barriers that prevented colonial subjects from achieving full equality. But the empire was also creating the tools of its own destruction. The education systems created by the British produced colonial elites who understood both Western ideas and local grievances. Men like Mahatma Gandhi in India, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya all were products of British education who turned that education against British rule. The communication networks built to control the empire, railroads, telegraphs, steamship lines, also allowed anti-imperial ideas to spread faster than ever before. Nationalist movements in different colonies could learn from each other, coordinate their activities, and present a unified front against imperial rule. Most importantly, the economic development promoted by the empire created new classes of people with the resources and organization to challenge British dominance. Indian merchants and industrialists, African miners, Caribbean sugar plantation workers. All these groups developed their own interests, which often conflicted with imperial policy. By the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire was like a vast machine that was running smoothly, but was consuming more and more fuel to maintain its operation. The machine was still powerful, still impressive, still capable of crushing any individual challenge to its authority. But it was also becoming increasingly expensive to run and increasingly difficult to justify. The burden of empire was growing heavier every year, and the British were beginning to question whether the benefits were worth the costs. The empire, which was once a source of strength, was becoming a source of weakness, a liability that Britain could neither renounce nor afford to maintain. The stage was set for the great crisis that would test the strength of the empire and expose its fundamental contradictions. That crisis would come in the form of two world wars that would drain Britain's resources and shatter its faith in its imperial mission.
The First World War. Maximum vulnerability. When the guns of August 1914 began to roar across Europe, few understood that they were witnessing the beginning of the end of the British Empire. The Great War, as it came to be called, would test the empire's strength as nothing before, exposing both its remarkable resilience and its fatal weaknesses. At first, the war seemed to demonstrate the unity and power of the empire. From every corner of the globe, British subjects rallied to the flag. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa declared war on Germany within days of Britain's declaration. India contributed enormously, providing over 1 million soldiers to the war effort. Even the smallest colonies sent whatever they could, men, money, and materials to fight the Central Powers. The response was extraordinary. Young men from the wheat fields of Saskatchewan and the sheep farms of New South Wales marched to fight in the trenches of France and Belgium. Indian regiments served on the Western Front, in Mesopotamia and in East Africa. South African forces conquered German Southwest Africa. Australian and New Zealand troops landed at Gallipoli in one of the most famous and tragic campaigns of the war. But this global mobilization came at a price that would ultimately prove fatal to the empire. The war cost Britain over £37 billion, more than the entire national income of the country at the start of the conflict. The national debt increased by over 1,000%. Britain, which had been the world's creditor, became the world's debtor, owing vast sums to the United States. More importantly, the war shattered the myth of European superiority that was central to the imperial ideology. The civilized nations of Europe tore each other apart with a savagery that shocked the world. Poison gas, machine guns, and artillery barrages turned the Western Front into a slaughterhouse where millions died for gains measured in yards. Colonial subjects, who were told they were fighting for civilization and democracy, saw European civilization destroy itself. Indian soldiers serving in France wrote home about the horrors they witnessed. African porters, who carried supplies for British troops in East Africa, saw white men killing each other with industrial efficiency. The moral authority of the white race, already questionable, was further eroded by the spectacle of European self-destruction. The war also accelerated the political changes that had been brewing for decades in India. The contribution to the war effort created expectations of political reform that the British were unwilling to meet. The Government of India Act of 1919 gave Indians a limited role in provincial government, but this fell far short of the self-government many had expected as a reward for their loyalty. The Rowlatt Acts of 1919, which gave the government emergency powers to arrest and detain Indians without trial, seemed to prove that British promises of reform were worthless. The response was the emergence of Mahatma Gandhi as the leader of Indian nationalism, with his revolutionary doctrine of non-violent resistance. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre on April 13, 1919, marked a turning point in British-Indian relations. General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to open fire on an unarmed crowd gathered in a walled garden in Amritsar, killing at least 379 people and wounding over 1,000. Dyer's actions were defended by many British officials as necessary to maintain order, but it shocked Indian public opinion and destroyed what remained of Indian faith in British justice. The massacre exposed the ugly reality behind the rhetoric of imperial benevolence. Faced with a challenge to their authority, the British were willing to use the same methods as any other imperial power. Overwhelming force, applied without mercy or discrimination. The civilizing mission was revealed as a thin veneer over the iron fist of military rule. Similar events occurred throughout the empire. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916 was suppressed with brutal efficiency, but it also created a new generation of nationalist martyrs. The execution of the rebellion's leaders turned them into heroes and galvanized Irish public opinion against British rule. The Irish War of Independence, 1919 to 1921, ended with the partition of Ireland and the creation of the Irish Free State. In Egypt, the 1919 revolution forced Britain to grant nominal independence in 1922, though British forces remained to protect the Suez Canal. In Iraq, a major revolt in 1920 required a massive military intervention to suppress. Even in the Dominions, there were signs of growing independence. Canada signed the Treaty of Versailles separately from Britain, asserting its right to conduct its own foreign policy. The war also exposed the empire's strategic vulnerabilities. The German U-boat campaign nearly starved Britain, cutting the sea lanes that connected the empire. The threat to the Suez Canal showed how easily the route to India could be cut. The alliance with Japan, necessary to protect British interests in the Pacific, was becoming increasingly unreliable as Japan pursued its own imperial ambitions. Most ominously, the war accelerated the rise of new powers that challenged British dominance. The United States emerged as the world's leading industrial and financial power. The Soviet Union, despite its internal chaos, presented a new ideological challenge to the imperial system. Japan was becoming the dominant power in East Asia. Germany, though defeated, retained the industrial potential to challenge Britain again. The British response to these challenges was confused and contradictory. Some officials, such as Winston Churchill, believed the empire could be preserved through force and resolve. Others, like the economist John Maynard Keynes, argued that the economic foundations of the empire were crumbling and that Britain needed to find new ways to sustain its global influence. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922 symbolized Britain's declining position. For the first time in over a century, Britain agreed to naval parity with another power, the United States. The Royal Navy, which had been the basis of British power for 3 centuries, was no longer supreme. The empire that emerged from the Great War was still vast and powerful, but it was also fundamentally changed. The easy confidence of the Victorian era was gone, replaced by a growing awareness of the empire's limitations and vulnerabilities. The war had been won, but at a cost that made it questionable whether the empire could survive another such test. A crack in the foundation had appeared, and in time, it would only widen. The interwar period. Economic and ideological breakdown. The 1920s and 30s were the Indian summer of the empire, a time of apparent stability and continued expansion that masked fundamental changes slowly undermining British power. On the surface, the empire seemed as strong as ever. The map was still colored pink from Canada to Australia, from India to South Africa. British administrators still governed hundreds of millions of subjects. The Royal Navy still patrolled the world's oceans. But beneath this facade of strength, the empire was slowly dying. The economic foundations of British power were collapsing. The Great War had turned Britain from the world's creditor into the world's debtor. The country owed vast sums to the United States, and interest payments alone consumed a significant portion of the government budget. The pound sterling, which had been the world's reserve currency for over a century, was under constant pressure. British industry, which had once dominated global markets, was losing ground to competitors in the United States, Germany, and Japan. The old staple industries, textiles, coal, steel, shipbuilding, were in decline, unable to compete with more modern and efficient producers. Unemployment was chronic, peaking at over 3 million in the worst years of the Depression. The empire, which had once been a source of wealth, was becoming an expensive liability. The cost of defending India alone consumed over half of Britain's defense budget. The dominions were increasingly reluctant to contribute to imperial defense, preferring to spend their money on domestic priorities. The colonies, which had once provided closed markets for British goods, were developing their own industries and reducing their dependence on British imports. The political challenges were even more severe. Across the empire, nationalist movements were gaining strength and sophistication. In India, the Indian National Congress evolved from a moderate organization seeking gradual reforms into a mass movement demanding complete independence. Mahatma Gandhi's campaigns of civil disobedience showed that the Raj could be challenged through nonviolent resistance. The Salt March of 1930 was a masterpiece of political theater. Gandhi's 300-mile march to the sea to manufacture salt in defiance of the British monopoly captured the world's imagination and demonstrated the moral bankruptcy of imperial rule. How could the British justify arresting an elderly man for making salt from seawater? The Government of India Act of 1935 attempted to satisfy Indian demands through a complex system of provincial autonomy and federal government. But it was too little, too late. The act satisfied neither British conservatives, who saw it as a dangerous concession to Indian nationalism, nor Indian nationalists, who saw it as an attempt to divide and rule. Similar developments were seen throughout the empire. In Burma, a nationalist movement gained ground under leaders like Aung San. In Ceylon, the Darmour Constitution of 1931 granted limited self-rule but did not satisfy nationalist aspirations. In the Middle East, the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 challenged British rule in Palestine, while nationalist movements in Egypt and Iraq demanded greater independence. Even in the Dominions, there were signs of growing independence. The Balfour Declaration of 1926 recognized the Dominions as equal to Britain, not subordinate, fundamentally changing the nature of the imperial relationship. The Statute of Westminster of 1931 gave the Dominions full legislative independence, effectively ending the legal unity of the empire. Ideological enemies and the eve of war. The rise of fascism and communism posed new ideological challenges to the imperial system. The Soviet Union offered an alternative model of development that appealed to many colonial subjects, particularly intellectuals and laborers who were excluded from the benefits of imperial rule. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany challenged British power directly, threatening the Mediterranean route to India and the security of the empire's African territories. The Abyssinian crisis of 1935 exposed the empire's weakness in the face of determined aggression. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, Britain was unable to take effective action to stop him. The League of Nations imposed sanctions, but they were ineffective without American and German participation. The crisis demonstrated that Britain could no longer act as the world's policeman without the support of other great powers. The Munich crisis of 1938 showed how severely British power had been diminished. Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement was not just a moral failure, it was a recognition of Britain's inability to fight a major war without allies. The empire, which had once been able to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, was now struggling to defend its own homeland. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 marked the beginning of the end of the British Empire. In contrast to World War I, which was primarily fought in Europe, this was a truly global conflict that would test every aspect of imperial power. The early years of the war were catastrophic for British prestige. The fall of France in June 1940 left Britain alone against Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain saved the homeland from invasion, but also revealed how vulnerable the empire had become. The Blitz showed that British cities could be bombed with impunity, shattering the myth of invulnerability that was central to the imperial ideology. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 drew the United States into the war, but it also involved Japan in conflict with the British Empire. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 was perhaps the most devastating blow to British prestige in the empire's history. The impregnable fortress fell to a Japanese army supposedly inferior to European forces. The surrender of over 100,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops at Singapore shattered the myth of white supremacy that was central to imperial rule. If the British could not defend their own territories against an Asian power, how could they claim to be the natural rulers of Asia? The Japanese conquest of Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and most of the Pacific showed that the age of European imperialism was ending. The old empires were being swept away by new forces they could neither understand nor control. The British Empire, which had once been seen as permanent and powerful just decades ago, proved to be as mortal as any other human institution. The war would eventually be won, but at a cost that would make the continuation of the empire impossible. The Britain that emerged from World War II would be a fundamentally different country than the one that entered it, bankrupt, exhausted, and dependent on American support for its very survival. The twilight of the gods had begun, and no dawn would follow. Victory and the death of empire. The Second World War was the British Empire's last great victory and its ultimate defeat. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, Britain stood among the victors, its flag still flying over vast territories, its prestige seemingly intact. But the war had drained the lifeblood of the empire, leaving it an empty shell that would collapse within a single generation. The statistics told the story of imperial exhaustion. Britain spent over £28 billion on the war, more than the entire national income of the country in 1939. The national debt tripled. The country's gold reserves vanished, spent on American arms and supplies. Britain, which entered the war as a creditor nation, emerged from it as the world's largest debtor. More devastating than the financial cost was the human price. Over 450,000 servicemen from Britain and the Commonwealth died in the war. Entire cities were ruined by German bombing. The merchant fleet, the lifeblood of the empire, lost over 30,000 men and 4,000 ships to enemy action. But the real damage was psychological. The war shattered the myth of British invincibility that was central to imperial rule. The fall of Singapore, the retreat from Burma, the near-total collapse of its position in the Middle East all showed that the British were not the unconquerable race they had proclaimed themselves to be. Colonial subjects who had been told they were fighting for freedom and democracy took those words seriously. Indian soldiers who fought in Burma and Italy returned home with new ideas about their rights and possibilities. African soldiers who served in the Middle and Far East returned with a wider understanding of the world and their place in it. The war also accelerated the social and political changes that made the old imperial system impossible to sustain. The Labour Party's victory in the 1945 election brought to power men who were skeptical of empire and committed to social reform at home. Clement Attlee, the new prime minister, had long believed that the empire was an expensive anachronism that diverted resources from domestic priorities. The new government faced an impossible choice: maintain the empire or rebuild Britain. The country simply did not have the resources to do both. The decision was made easier by the growing strength of nationalist movements across the empire and the declining strategic value of many imperial territories. India and the waterfall of decolonization. India was the first and most important domino to fall. The Indian National Congress and the Muslim League had supported the war effort, but they did so with the understanding that independence would follow victory. When the war ended, they were not prepared to wait any longer. The cabinet mission of 1946 attempted to find a formula for the unity of India, but the growing antagonism between Hindus and Muslims made this impossible. The demand for Pakistan, a separate state for the subcontinent's Muslims, could not be ignored. Partition became inevitable, despite its appalling human cost. Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, was given the impossible task of transferring power while maintaining order. The partition of India in August 1947 was accompanied by intercommunal violence that claimed the lives over 1 million people and displaced another 12 million. It was a tragic end for the jewel in the crown, but it was also a recognition that the age of empire was over. The loss of India was followed by a cascade of independence movements across the empire. Burma became independent in January 1948, followed by Ceylon in February. Palestine, which had become ungovernable due to conflict between Jews and Arabs, was handed over to the United Nations in May 1948. The pattern was repeated across Africa and Asia. Ghana became independent in 1957, followed by Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, and dozens of other territories in the following decades. By the 1970s, the British Empire was reduced to a handful of small islands and territories that were too small or too remote to achieve viable independence. The process of decolonization was not always peaceful. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, the Malayan emergency, the Cyprus crisis, the Suez crisis, all showed that the British were willing to fight to maintain their empire, but they also showed that such fights were ultimately fruitless. The Suez crisis of 1956 was perhaps the most humiliating moment in the decline of the empire. When Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France launched a military intervention to regain control. The operation was a military success, but a political disaster. The United States and the Soviet Union condemned the intervention, and Britain was forced to withdraw in disgrace. Suez demonstrated that Britain no longer could act as a great power without American support. The special relationship with the United States, which had been forged in the war, became a relationship of dependency, not partnership. Britain was reduced to the role of America's junior partner, a role that many found hard to accept. The economic end and a new place in the world. The economic foundations of the empire also crumbled. The sterling area, which was the financial basis of the empire, was undermined by repeated currency crises. The pound was devalued in 1949 and again in 1967. The decision to float the pound in 1972 marked the end of the pound's role as an international reserve currency. British industry, which once dominated global markets, was losing ground to competitors in Germany, Japan, and the newly industrializing nations of Asia. The old imperial markets were no longer closed. Former colonies were free to trade with whoever offered the best terms. The Commonwealth, which was meant to sustain economic links between Britain and its former colonies, became little more than a talking shop. By the 1970s, it was clear that the British Empire was finished. The pink on the map had faded to a few scattered dots. The Royal Navy, which once ruled the waves, was reduced to a coastal defense force. The country that once governed a quarter of the world's population was struggling to govern itself. The end of empire was marked not by one dramatic event, but by a gradual recognition that the age of European imperialism was over. The forces that created the empire, industrial supremacy, maritime dominance, technological advantage, had been spread throughout the world. Other countries could now do what Britain had once done uniquely well. The hour of reckoning had come, and it was final. The greatest empire in human history lasted less than 4 centuries, a brief moment in the long flow of human history. It transformed the world for better and for worse, but it also transformed itself out of existence. The British Empire died, but its legacy would live on in the language, laws, and institutions that it spread across the globe. The question now was what would take its place in the global order it had created. Today, if you walk the streets of London, you can still see the ghosts of empire everywhere. The grand buildings of Whitehall, where the Colonial Office once governed a quarter of the world. The monuments to imperial heroes in Trafalgar Square and Parliament Square. The museums filled with treasures taken from every corner of the globe. The street names themselves, India House, Australia House, Canada House, speak of a time when London was the capital of the world. But the empire itself is gone, vanished like the Roman legions or the Mongol hordes. The pink has faded from the map, replaced by the flags of independent nations. The Royal Navy, which once ruled the waves, has been reduced to a handful of ships. The country that once governed 400 million people is now struggling to govern 67 million. Nevertheless, the legacy of empire lives on in ways both visible and invisible, beneficial and harmful. The English language, spread by imperial conquest and trade, became the global lingua franca. The legal systems of dozens of countries are based on English common law. Parliamentary democracy, pioneered at Westminster, was adopted with modifications throughout the world. The economic system the empire created, global capitalism, based on free trade and the movement of capital, became the dominant model of human organization. The communication networks built to control the empire evolved into the internet that connects the world. But the empire's legacy is not entirely positive. Arbitrary borders drawn by imperial administrators have become sources of conflict from the Middle East to Africa. Racial hierarchies created to justify imperial rule left deep scars on societies worldwide. The economic exploitation that enriched Britain impoverished many of its former colonies, creating patterns of underdevelopment that persist to this day. The partition of India, the creation of Israel, the artificial states of Africa, all bear the mark of imperial decisions that prioritized British interests over local realities. The consequences of these decisions continue to shape global politics, creating conflicts that have lasted for generations. 24. Lessons for the modern world. Perhaps most importantly, the British Empire set the template for modern globalization, the integration of the world economy, the movement of people and ideas across national borders, the creation of international institutions. All of this has its roots in the imperial system that Britain created. But the empire also demonstrated the limits of power and the inevitability of change. No matter how dominant an empire becomes, how permanent it seems, it carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Success breeds complacency. Expansion creates overstretch, and the very forces that create an empire ultimately turn against it. The British learned this lesson the hard way. Their empire collapsed not due to a single catastrophic defeat, but due to the gradual erosion of the foundations of their power. Economic decline, military overextension, nationalist resistance, and changing global conditions all combined to make the empire unsustainable. The same forces that destroyed the British Empire are at work today. The United States, which inherited Britain's role as the dominant global power, faces many of the same challenges that brought down its predecessor. Economic competition from rising powers, military commitments around the globe, Domestic political divisions and shifting international norms all threaten American hegemony. China, which suffered from British imperialism for over a century, is now becoming a potential successor to American dominance. China's Belt and Road Initiative, an ambitious plan to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe through infrastructure investments, bears a striking resemblance to the imperial networks that once connected the British Empire. But the world has changed since the era of European imperialism. The old methods of control, military conquest, economic exploitation, racial hierarchy, are no longer acceptable or effective. Modern empires must be built on different foundations: economic integration, technological innovation, cultural influence, and international cooperation. The British Empire was a product of its time, shaped by the specific circumstances of the 18th and 19th centuries. It could not have existed without the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, and the peculiar balance of global forces that gave Britain a temporary advantage. That world is gone, and it will not return. The future belongs to other forms of organization, other ways of exercising power, other relationships between peoples and nations. The age of empire is over, and the age of something else has begun. The history of the British Empire is a story of human ambition and human folly, of great achievements and terrible crimes, of the rise and fall of civilizations. It is a story that reminds us of both the possibilities and the limits of human power. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that no empire, however great, is eternal. The British learned this lesson, as the Romans learned it before them, as the Americans may learn it in their turn. Power is temporary, but human history continues. The British Empire conquered the world, but the world eventually conquered the British Empire. And in that conquest, perhaps lies the seed of a better future for all humanity.